Is footage from the first episode of The Watchmen, which premiered just last week on HBO, which I watched. And ever since I watched it, you're seeing the massacre of African Americans in Tulsa in 1921. I've been worried since I watched that, how many people are actually going to know that that was not something that they just made up for the show, but an actual historical event, one of the darkest individual things that has ever happened in American history. And thanks in part to a very effective cover up at the time and a lack of interest in our education system in educating people about the dark side of American history, how many people are actually going to know the reality of what happened there? And so I thought, this is not news, but it's important that we take stock of what our country is actually about, what its history has been. And so I wanted to give just a little bit of information about that particular event.
I'm down.
Okay, so the Tulsa Race Massacre began May 31st, 1921, when a white mob set fire to hundreds of black-owned businesses and homes, killing at least 300 people. More than 10,000 black residents were left homeless, and as many as 40 blocks were left smoldering. So there's a lot of accounts from the time. It apparently started when a black shoe shine stepped on the foot, apparently, of a white woman in an elevator, which led to him being arrested, a lynch mob coming for him, and when he wasn't turned over to the mob, the insane racist white mob began killing as many African Americans as they could in the area and began burning down the businesses. As I talked about earlier, this was known as Black Wall Street. It boasted more than 300 black-owned businesses, including 2 theaters. And there's a lot of contemporaneous reporting from the time saying that many white people in the area were enraged with jealousy that there was an area where African American run businesses were doing well, and that there was a class developing in the city that was relatively more affluent and well off. And this ended up happening, the killing of at least hundreds of people. We don't know exactly how many, because the racist mobs were dumping bodies in mass graves, some of which still haven't been found, although the search continues more than 80 years after the event itself.
Yeah, there were so many layers to this disaster that they officially called riots, because that sounds more like there was some kind of fight going on, or maybe the minorities in that area were carrying out violence, because that's always been the characteristic that we just place on folks, that we want to victimize and then call them the aggressors. So it was actually a massacre. It was actually mass murder. It was actually an attack and an invasion. I mean, bombs were being dropped from overhead in an American city, on a certain part of an American city, because of the residents that live there, but we can call it riots instead. Children of many of the white residents were armed from in other areas and sent down there to go shoot innocent people, because hey, you can go shoot innocent people, here's our chance. After all this is happening, then the authorities, we've talked about many times, this is why history is a big deal and the reason why we cover it up. This legacy lives on. This is 1921. This legacy lives on in today, the way that our policing follows people and actually causes them to be victims when causes them to be the aggressors when they were actually the victims. This isn't new. This is the reason why we can bring up old things that people don't want to talk about anymore, because how dare you hate America enough to bring up the things that we've done here or allowed and sanctioned with our authorities. That's the problem with systemic racism. It's been there since the beginning, and it continues to live there in many other forms. So to learn about it is to try and stop it, and to stop learning about it is to continue to have it happen.
Let me give you a little bit more information, and a lot of this is coming from Deneen Brown's a great article from a few years back in Washington Post. You should definitely read more. They have some interviews with people who had talked to family members in the years after it. So she says, black men, women, and children who survived were rounded up and detained in camps at the city's fairgrounds. Survivors of the massacre recounted seeing the bodies of black people loaded onto trains and dumped off bridges into the Arkansas River. Witnesses reported seeing bodies tossed into mass graves. Carloads of armed whites began making drive-by shootings. It was just free-for-all murder. It was totally acceptable murder at the time. White city police officers deputized members of the lynch mob. As you alluded to, they gave out guns to white citizens to go hunt down African Americans. There were reports that white men flew airplanes above Greenwood dropping kerosene bombs. And one report says that Tulsa was likely the first city in the US to ever be bombed, and by its own people, because one group of people hated another and was jealous of their financial success there.
Think about that every time you talk a racist talk about how black folks don't do enough for themselves, pull themselves up by their bootstraps, do something. Why don't you build up your community? Communities get built up, and this has happened in the past, and they get taken down because of jealousy.
Yeah, and so after the more than 14 hours of the mass murder, thankfully martial law was declared, and the authorities came in and rounded up and detained the black victims, not the people who had been doing the killing. No one suffered any legal consequences for what was done, not a single individual. And despite the fact this happened in American City in 1921, in Oklahoma, it didn't enter the curriculum for education until the year 2000.
Ask your friends if they've heard about this. Most of them won't.
It's insane. Everyone should know about what happened. Check out the Damage Report podcast each day, wherever you get your podcasts, whether Pocket Casts or Stitcher or iTunes. You can join me as I give you the news and stories you want, with a range of co-hosts and interview guests jumping in on the fun each day. Again, that's the Damage Report, wherever you get your podcasts. And if you get them at iTunes, don't forget to rate and review. Sometimes I'll read them live on the show.